Yeah, recently I visited prison for the second time in my life, and it was an experience.
Like there are a lot of twists and turns and intervening forces that could send us down a very dark path.
And at the end of the day, everybody is human. The Singapore Prison Service has a very big focus on rehab, on support.
And then on the other hand, there are leaders who create an environment where people are passionate about their work. They really care.
What is realistic? And what can I do as a leader to actually help people get to what's reasonable?
I know from our experiences and conversations, the people that work in that prison, the staff really care. They actually care about the prisoners and they want them to succeed. You know, we all have colorful pasts. We all have experiences behind us that we're not always talking about. I thought today would be a good chance for you to talk about the time that you spent in prison.
Yeah, I think there are some things we can learn from that. We all aspire to be good people and to do the right things in life. And I'm pretty sure my parents would have opinions about some of the choices I made as a youth. These things form us and make us who we are. And yeah, recently I visited prison for the second time in my life. And it was an experience. I think we can draw some learnings from that.
And part of how you bring this up to talking about, you know, like we've had things in our youth, maybe we made mistakes. One of the things I think is really interesting is it isn't necessarily a certain thing that we end up where we end up in our life. Like there are a lot of twists and turns and intervening forces that could send us down a very dark path. You know, like I feel like when I hear about these stories about people in prison, I feel like, gosh, like in another universe, I could be one of those people. You know, so foundationally, I don't feel like I'm necessarily better than them. I just think in a lot of ways I might be luckier, you know, and a lot of it is roll of the dice that, you know, I made the choices I made and they worked out.
Yeah. There's a lot of privilege as well. I think you and I are very fortunate that the odds of us ending up in a situation like that are probably smaller. Not probably, are without question.
Speak for yourself. Yeah.
Well, yes. And there is a twist. But generally speaking, there are, of course, certain sections of society who are far less privileged and therefore more likely to end up in these situations. And at the end of the day, everybody is human. So there are things we can learn from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so tell us about that experience you had most recently.
All right. Well, here's the twist. I did visit prison recently. I visited the prison, Changi prison specifically in Singapore. And I went as a visitor as part of a program that we are running for the Singapore government. And it was a lot of different things. I gotta say, like, it was illuminating. It's kind of jaw-dropping. It was very humbling. Yeah, I noticed even as we're talking about it, I'm like, yeah, wow, there was a lot of different things that I experienced that day. We were a group of 5 people from the MBA team, which is a small section of the coaches working on this project at the moment with the Singapore Prison Service. It was a very real experience, far more real than I imagined, actually.
Real meaning what?
We got locked in a cell for a while. We visited a cell block. We were extraordinarily well taken care of. I can't thank the SPS, the Singapore Prison Service officers, enough for being so welcoming and so open, and they did a really great job at setting context and showing us how it works, giving us a sense of their daily life and so on. We were on a wing. We got to, you know, spend some time in one of the cells, and it's humbling in its simplicity. The Singapore Prison Service has a very big focus on rehab, on support. And at the same time, they also, when people are in prison, there are limitations on what they get as part of the, quote unquote punishment. The cells are very bare. Everybody has a reed mat and a simple plastic box with very basic necessities in it. It's a very small room. We were in a room that hosts 8 prisoners, and we were talking with the prison officers and, with some colleagues. And at a certain moment, our host kind of playfully closed the door, but it's like, wow, you really get a feel for it. So it's very real in that sense.
Mm.
Prisoners are spending many hours in these spaces on a day-to-day basis as part of their rehab.
I'm going to encourage you in this conversation to be super specific about what it was like for you and what you saw. Like, I don't think it's necessarily helpful for our audience for you to kind of sugarcoat anything. I think like you saw a lot of like kind of raw stuff. I remember
Mm,
even in the conversations we had that day after you'd gone through that experience, like it
yeah,
was emotionally affecting for you. I could see.
it was. Um, it was scary. It was definitely scary. Before we went in, we were think in the movies when you see people go between a gate and it clangs shut and then another one opens, right? There are never 2 gates open at once, or there are never 2 doors open at once. So you have to sort of move through at a pretty slow pace. We're waiting for some gate to open, and one of the officers asked us, how many officers do you think there are per prisoner? Let me say that again. He asked us, what do we think the ratio is of prisoners to prison officers? And knowing that the Singapore government invests very heavily in rehabilitation and they believe heavily in like reintegration to community, I said something like 3-1, 3 prisoners for every 1 officer, because I assumed that there was like this extraordinary amount of sort of support. It turns out it's more like I don't remember the exact number, but I think there were 7 officers on duty for 300 prisoners at any one time.
Wow.
So then I'm thinking, and you open this door and we go into a space where 300 prisoners are. So I was a little scared of that.
I think that number that you thought, the 3-1 number, that's more like what it would be staffed to passengers like on a cruise ship, like a high end cruise ship or something like that,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So really interesting that like what do we assume about how this is done?
Yeah, I mean, it was almost embarrassing. I was like, I'm living in a fantasy world. I know that they take care of people. I know that they have a strong reputation for supporting people with rehab, and I got that so wrong. I was kind of embarrassed. Then I was scared. I'm like, we're walking through one reception area towards a cell block which is empty because all the prisoners are in a day room watching a movie. But we walked past all the prisoners to go to this block. And they're not very far away. They're all staring at us. And I'm suddenly thinking, we have 2 guards. We have 2 officers with us. And there's probably maybe 150 people in that particular room watching us. They're not very far away. That was uncomfortable. So there's more here, but I guess I want to ask you, like, if you imagine walking into a prison space, what do you imagine based on what you've seen? Because I know you've not been to prison, but like, what do you imagine? Like, let me say that differently. Maybe like how close to what I'm sharing is what you would imagine.
Hmm. Uh, yeah, I think for me, I was surprised by the ratio. That
Mm,
that is not close to what I had imagined. Um, and I think what's interesting is my reference point is mostly movies and TV shows about prison in the U.S. because that's what I was raised on.
mm,
And so it to me it seems far scarier. It feels like the individuals are very very dangerous and very volatile, And and I think the other factor that I would imagine, again, based on the experiences in this country and sort of the imagery, is that the lack of hope in that environment would also um, make individuals less restrained and more threatening, more volatile, more dangerous, more unpredictable. So it sounds to me like in your experience, people were generally quite well behaved. I don't imagine that that would be quite as true here, but I could be wrong. You know.
Yeah, it would be interesting to explore, but my perception is very similar to yours, and I think what stood out here was there is a palpable sense of respect between the officers and the prisoners. In the MBA principles, we talk about leaders never forgetting that they're working with humans, and this was evident the entire
Mm,
time we were there.
yeah.
There is this really struck me, and I think this is probably my biggest takeaway was how respectful and human the prison officers were. The hierarchy is clear. They're in charge. The prisoners, they have to be obedient. There are rules they need to follow and so on. But the fact that they are given so much respect and treated as humans means that there is that sort of tension that you mentioned is there. But every time we walked into a room, the prisoners would stop what they were doing and they would say, "Good morning, sir," or "Good morning, ma'am," to the
Mm,
the officer accompanying us every single time, and
mm,
everybody did it. And on the one hand, it's kind of maybe a little bit rote, they understand this got to be done, but you could feel that sense of respect between the two, and you could sort of feel that sense of two-way street. We talk about leaders putting relationship first always and so on, and that was palpable.
mm.
That was palpable. And I think it's
And
what makes it possible for such a small number of officers to interact with such a large group of prisoners who are there for good reason.
wondering about that ritual of good morning, sir, good morning, ma'am, or whatever. It sounds to me like that is enforced. Like they do it because they have to or they're expected to. And my so where I go with my curiosity is there's a purpose for that. Maybe it is to kind of reestablish behaviors around hierarchy. Or I mean, or maybe it's more simple. Maybe it's more about like we're reinforcing habits around just general respect and kindness. I don't know, but there is something interesting and intentional about that.
Definitely intentional. I didn't think to ask the question. But my hunch is it's a bit of both. I think on the
Mm-hmm.
one hand, you're here for a certain amount of time. You're a prisoner. These are the norms. When an officer walks by, you be polite. You say good morning or good afternoon. I think it's also for a lot of these people. These are a lot of these prisoners are people who have not had great opportunities in society, and the focus here is on rehabilitating them. These prisoners are being offered opportunities to learn how to cook. They're being taught about logistics so that they have opportunities when they go back into community to work in one of those two fields. The prison service works with a charity that actually helps facilitate these things. And so, in a way, I think the very basic, like respect for authority, is also intended to help them when they go back out into the community where they may have done things that suited them in the past, but perhaps, it's also part of what had them end up in prison. Being able to go to a job and have respect for the shift leader or something like that. So I think there's kind of a two-way street. I think there is an element of, this society says you've committed a crime, you're going to be locked up for a certain period of time, and you will follow established norms. The trade-off is you will be treated with respect. If you have a problem, any officer will come and talk to you. Every officer is carrying a personal device that can look at your history, can look at your family situation. Everybody gets to talk to a counselor or a psychologist. Family visits are facilitated. They have access to email to talk to their family. Like there's a lot of
Mm,
interaction, and I think this is one of the things that I found so inspiring about the way the prison service leads its own people. they're encouraged to interact with the prisoners. They're encouraged to create relationships with them. And so it's almost like, be respectful to us and you will be treated with respect. And it works. And you and I know this from all of our workplace work, right? Like if I'm working with a leader who treats me respectfully, I will make more of an effort to contribute, to behave. Same thing here in a very different environment. But they never forget that they're working with humans. And I think you mentioned, US sort of TV shows and movies. And I think, unfortunately, that's more of the norm. Most places in the world, prisoners are not considered humans.
So a lot of what you're bringing up here makes me think of our principle about leaders playing the long game. Just as an example, I think the prison systems we have in the US are very short-term oriented. There is sort of a nominally a commitment to rehabilitation, but I don't really believe that most prisons are doing effective rehabilitation. And we see the result of that. The thing that most moves me about Singapore is they're really doing rehabilitation. That is, at least from your description, that's the primary purpose for the prison.
Yes, totally. It's the primary purpose for the prison. And I don't remember the stats because I couldn't take any notes. I wasn't even allowed to wear my watch, never mind take anything with me inside. So I don't remember exactly the stats. But it is like absolutely the foundation of everything they do. And extraordinary to note, like there's an empty prison block. They don't need all the space. They have lower rates of incarceration now than they did 15, 20 years ago. And again, I don't remember the numbers, but the rates of reoffending, it's not zero. That would be a pipe dream, but it's low. It
Yeah,
works.
and lower and lower. And I think a lot of it comes from that commitment. One of the things I remember when I first came to Singapore, one of the civil service employees gave us quite an elaborate tour of the island, and they took us to the prison. We didn't see it from the inside; we saw it from the outside. But what I remembered was it was located in a park, and part of the intention of building it in a park or building a park around it was because families would be encouraged to come and visit on the weekend. And the whole idea behind that was the more we could involve the families, the more likely the prisoners were to have a sense of stability that they were going to return to. So keeping people connected to their communities was super important. Again, kind of playing the long game of like, what's the long-term vision?
This was also something else that was inspiring to see. Like we got to see the little video rooms that they've set up for people to have video conference with their families. So they're allowed to have face-to-face meetings on a fixed term basis, maybe like once a month. And then they're also allowed to have video ones at a different rhythm. What was really cool was to learn that the government has set up video conference facilities around different parts of the island so that families who don't live near Changi prison can actually go to these other facilities and get on a video call with their loved ones without having to come all the way to the prison, without having to go through all the security and stuff to get to a video room within the main prison. For those of you who are not familiar with the region, Changi prison is on the far east coast of Singapore. Now, Singapore's not that big, but if you're an underprivileged family or an extended family and you have to get from the other side of the island, well, the government is trying to make it easier so that you don't forget your loved one who's in rehab, who's in prison.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of intention around that. And maybe they learned the hard way from encountering some of these roadblocks. Hearing people say, "Oh, I don't communicate with my loved one because it's too hard to get there or it's too hard to get on video or whatever." So they solved the problem.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
And they spend a lot of time working with the families as well to make sure that they are prepared to receive their loved ones back into community. So yeah, super interesting. Really interesting.
Yeah.
So I took one for the team, and I went to prison on behalf of NBA. And I also shout out to our colleagues who were able to come with us as well, because
Mm-hmm.
it really was an experience. Do you want to know what the wildest part was?
Sure.
Do you remember I mentioned the roughly 100 and something people watching a movie?
Right.
Well, the other, I want to say roughly similar amount of people who were not watching a movie were in the yard. And at one point they were like, oh, let's go look at the yard. I'm thinking we'll go look through a gate or maybe over a balcony. And as we walk down this corridor, just like in the movies, there's an open gate at the end and there's a guard. And he's looking at me and I'm looking at him. And then I'm like, is that prisoners like right beside him? Right around him? Kind of everywhere? And I sort of get nudged into this yard. And I got to say, it was probably one of the most intense experiences of my life because, like I said, maybe 150 people. It could be more. But some of them are sitting on tables which are bolted to the ground, just like in the movies. Some of them are jogging, running around, playing basketball, whatever. The moment we walked into that room, the 150 pair of eyes turned. It was like it was like somebody hit the mute button.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody turned around and stared at us. And again,
Mm-hmm.
Andrew, white guy, right at the front. And I don't know if you ever had 150 pairs of eyes suddenly stare at you, but it's hot. There's no aircon in prison. Everybody's got their top off. They're just in shorts and flip-flops. It's intense. It's really intense.
Mm-hmm. Where did your mind go when that happened?
Honestly, like it's I feel a little embarrassed, but I think it's probably relatively a natural experience. But as we walked in, my mind went, where are the guards? That
Mm.
was my first thought. My first thought was, where are the guards? And there were 3 guards. And I think 3 of our accompanying officers with us who are not in uniform at that time. So they don't have any protective gear or, batons or anything. So we have 3 very senior, experienced prison officers, but not in prison gear. And then I think 3 guards in that room. So 1 guard for every 50 people, roughly.
Yeah.
And I didn't know where to look. I sort of focused my gaze down, and there was some guy a couple of feet away from me using a pair of nail clippers, which were attached to a chain, which was attached to the table. That's what I remembered.
Mm.
But I just remember thinking, wow, I know that one of our team has a family member who spent time there many years ago. And so I was sort of imagining what that's like to know, oh, this is, my uncle was here or my dad was here. It was extremely humbling. I was very, very grateful that I was not in a position to have to live that every day. And I was extremely grateful for my life circumstances and my choices. I get to go home.
Mm.
I got
Yeah.
to get on a bus and leave.
Well, and also, I mean, when you tell me that story of these guys ate to a cell, sleeping on mats on the floor, that for me, I'm like, and no air conditioning. I'm like, in Singapore,
Yeah.
I would not survive a day. I don't need. I'd probably pass out. I mean, how? So it's also one of those weird things of like how delicate am I that such an experience seems like incomprehensible.
Yeah. Yeah. It's true. I don't know. Like there's one bit of aircon. Do you know where it is?
No, probably in the office, right?
In the video room. So
Oh,
if you're having a video meeting with your family, which I think is limited to like
oh,
20 or 30 minutes once a month. So like once a month you can get 20 or 30
mm-hmm.
minutes of aircon. That's it.
Wow,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. We're delicate, man. We wouldn't make it, I don't think.
Jeez.
We wouldn't make it. Here's a fun thing about that. Just afterwards, our host said to me, did you make eye contact with anybody in the yard? And I was like, oh, I tried so hard not to. I was terrified, you know. And he was like, no, you have to stare them down. And I was like, really? They're big. They look a little angry, and there's a lot of, you know, it's stereotypical, right? But you got a lot of tattoos, you got gang stuff in there. And it's kind of like, I'm not comfortable staring these guys down. And he said, there's 7 of us and 300 of them. You have to, like, you're taught this on day one. That's also how we maintain the power balance so that everybody knows where they are and nobody gets upset. It was really interesting.
Right. So stare them down. And then you go back to the office where after you've learned to stare down everybody, and you stare down your your direct reports, and you stare down your coworkers.
Well, this is it's funny that you should mention that, because that was ironically one of the things that came up. Is like, oh, as prison officers, so young prison officers who enter the service will always start in a place like where we were, in one of these blocks. And our host was actually saying exactly that. Like, one of the challenges is they forget to not do this in the office. He was even kind of joking that, you know, his wife tells him to stop staring at people in public because he doesn't have to stare them down. They're like free citizens, you know.
Right, exactly.
Stop scaring those people at the table.
Staring everybody with
dinner.
You.
But yeah, I gotta say, man, like a super humbling experience, and and honestly, like, you and I work in a lot of orgs. We talk about how our leaders working with the people around them. This was pretty exemplary. Both to the prisoners, the respect, the human, really, like, let's say, respecting the human condition. They understand privilege. They know well that people have run into issues and challenges in life, and they really believe in people's ability to do better if they want to, and they give them the opportunities to do so. And they don't expect everybody to be successful, but that level of care was extraordinary. And I'm thinking, like, if prison leaders can do this to prisoners, who some of them have committed pretty awful crimes, there's a lot of hope for leaders in the average workplace to treat people with respect.
Yeah. Well, and that's where, so this takes me to an interesting place. And I promise that there'll be a relevant connection after my brief rant. But I hear this and I feel like embarrassed and upset about how prisons are run in my country. I feel like they're not playing the long game, not even slightly. That there isn't really an intention of turning, because so, and like, for example, in Singapore, I know that the intention and priority is to have people enter the prison as criminals, because that's how they got there, and leave as workers. And they do that. And they have a plan, and they follow their plan, and they actually make that outcome happen. And I don't think that that's how things run here. I think, and in a lot of cases, criminals come out as better criminals in this country. And I think a lot of it has to do with the initial intention. If I sort of sense the national mood about crime and people that commit crime, I think that prisons here are made to hurt people. You know, you hurt us, we're going to hurt you back. And we just want you to suffer, and you get to be there and suffer. And then, you know, when the law says you come out, you come out. It's kind of it. And I know not all prisons in this country are like that. There are definitely wonderful exceptions that I've heard about. The reason I bring this up is in our work, I think that there are leaders who are like this too, very short-term vision, very focused on just immediate results, don't really care about the people, don't care what happens to them. We're just going to do the thing. And they get the results they get, you know. And then on the other hand, there are leaders who create an environment where people are passionate about their work. They really care. I know from our experiences and conversations, the people that work in that prison the staff really care. They actually care about the prisoners, and they want them to succeed. Like, how amazing is that?
Yeah, it's
I
extraordinary.
shouldn't be like, I shouldn't be shocked by that, right? But I am.
No, it's really an ideal. And about 12 years ago, I visited a prison in Europe as part of another project. Seems to be a bit of a theme in Andrew's professional career, but
Mm-hmm.
um, it was forgettable. It was forgettable. You know, it worked like a prison. People are incarcerated for committing crimes, and then they're sent home. I didn't have the depth of experience that I had here, so I can't. It's not really comparing like for like, but it was forgettable in the sense that I just felt the leaders were just running a prison.
Mm.
What the distinction you're making here, I think this is really interesting. I think in Singapore, punishment equals learning. We'll punish you for your crime, and we will put you in a position where you can learn something about your crime. They make such a big they have such a big emphasis on we need you to understand how you got here,
Mm.
and then we can help you learn how to not come back. So
Mm.
punishment is kind of like the in parentheses, and then the focus really is learning. Whereas what you're talking about, I think the more typical, you use the US example, it's more like revenge.
Yeah.
Like, so in parentheses is hurting you, right? We're gonna take our revenge on you. We're gonna use our power over you as opposed to our power to support you. And I think that analogy applies in the workplace generally, right? Do I have a leader who punishes me, quote unquote, right? But like who will sanction me for something I didn't do well with the purpose of teaching me something, right? Do they want to grow me, or are they just going to take revenge on me?
Mm.
Are
And
they
do
going
they know
to
the difference?
do they know the difference, right? Take revenge, use my power. I will not give you a promotion. I will not give you this job change. I will not give you the resources you need to complete your job successfully because I'm taking revenge on you.
Mm.
Versus, let's have a learning conversation about this. This didn't go well. You didn't perform appropriately here. Let's discuss how do we help you do this better and so on. So yeah, I was thinking punishment versus revenge.
Sure. Well, it makes me think of kind of the mental models around failure and disappointment. So if you're a leader, you're going to encounter failure, yours or people that you work with, and you're going to be disappointed in other people. Humans disappoint each other. So what do you do with that? Those are feelings that are hard to be with. What do you do with those?
Mm.
Do you lash out? Do you punish people? Uh, and do you pretend that that punishment is growing them,
Well,
or are you really growing them?
yes.
Yeah.
It reminded me of a conversation I had yesterday with a guy that I know here. He works as a trauma therapist, and this was super interesting because he was saying we have expectations of people that are generally reasonable based on our experience of life, but we often don't have expectations that are realistic based on the subject person. And I thought this was really interesting, this contrast between reasonable and realistic. So,
Mm.
as a leader who's got someone who's struggling, I might reasonably expect that they would know how to do this, but it's not realistic for me to expect it because I haven't given them opportunities to learn this previously, right?
Mm.
So I've got my own filter, right? And so it's the same, like when I look at how the prison service is responding to the people in their care, there is a reasonable expectation that these people can function in society and be good citizens. Realistically, right now, they're coming in with drug problems, abuse problems. So we're actually meeting them where they are. You know, we talk in MBA about leaders listen, right? Leaders have presence. They're meeting these people where they are so that they can help them get to that place. So it's like reasonable expectation versus realistic expectation.
Right. And because if you treated somebody who was just entering prison as, I don't know, as you might treat an employee in a workplace, it might not work. They may not be there.
Mm-hmm. But it's also, I think,
Interesting.
unrealistic. When you think about like the American model you were referring to before, it's kind of like people are often punished for, well, you did a bad thing, so you're wrong. It's like, okay, that's reasonable, but it's not necessarily realistic. do we know about this person's background? Do we know what opportunities have not been afforded to them? Do we know what kind of trauma or abuses they've experienced in life? Like, what is realistic to expect of somebody?
Hmm.
So there's a sort of almost like they're being blamed for not being up to a certain standard, which is unrealistic. And so I think what I like about this
Yeah.
model, and this can apply in a workplace, is what is realistic? And what can I do as a leader to actually help people get to what's reasonable?
It also makes me think about the importance of curiosity, which is kind of built into the model of that prison in Singapore. That like we need to get curious about what got you here. You
Mm-hmm.
need to get curious about that.
Mm-hmm.
Like we have to approach it with that curiosity and not just make assumptions.
Yes.
So really important. And I think that the consciousness that I think is really important here, but also I think maps to other kinds of leadership, is the power of a person's environment to influence them. Because a lot of those prisoners are probably there because their environment limited or narrowed their choices to such a point that they had to take certain actions to survive. That's true for a lot of people who end up, I think, in prison, is
Mm.
like they didn't feel like they had a choice. The environment creates that kind of circumstance. And knowing how powerful a force the environment is, if you don't understand that and you can't reconstruct that environment in a more productive way, then you're kind of in trouble. And this goes to anybody who wants to change. If your environment is not conducive to the change you want to make, it's going to be really hard or impossible to make that change.
Well, I think this is a great point you're making, because we talk often about, are leaders encouraging people to grow? Are they giving them opportunities to grow, or are they just telling them what to do? Right? Leaders
Mm,
lead and managers manage. Right? So
mm,
yeah, most people are hungry to learn and grow if we give them the space to do so.
mm-hmm. Yes.
So yeah, it was an experience, and before we wrap up, I do want to tell you about one of the most touching moments. Can I tell you about one of the most
Okay.
touching moments?
Yes. And I have something else I want to mention before we wrap up.
Okay. At one point, our host was like, "Oh, we should go and check out this particular area of the prison. It's I forget the name of it, but it was basically like the artists' wing. So they have
Mm,
a lot of people who've obviously had a lot of time in prison. Many of them have already come in with certain talents, but there is an entire section of the prison devoted just to like encouraging prisoners to experiment with art, pottery,
mm,
things
mm,
they make that could be sold, and so on. So it wasn't part of the tour, but we ended up in that wing. And the officer in charge said, "Oh, feel free to interact with the prisoners in here. Different prisoners doing different things." And some of the things that we saw were extraordinary. Like the talent was exceptional. What I remember most was the smiles on the faces of these prisoners who had a lot of space to just be in a creative environment. And we saw different things. We saw batik, we saw oil painting, we saw pottery, but it was the smiles on their faces. And the officer in charge was kind of like a buddy, like slapping them on the back and like chit chatting.
mm,
But they were really sweet. They were really like, you could tell that this was doing something special for them.
mm,
And I, that was very heartwarming.
mm.
Yeah, it was heartwarming.
That's beautiful. Well,
Mm.
like everybody gets a chance to be creative. And I think that that's also really fulfilling on the level of a person's soul,
Mm-hmm.
you know, to be able to express yourself creatively and explore that way. And maybe it brings people closer to their hearts. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I like
Yeah,
to
I
think
think so.
so.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in the course of our conversation, I happen to remember that a family member of mine has also been to prison.
Oh,
Now, like you, she was more of a visitor, and not an incarcerated person. My mother, for a number of years, was a professional belly dancer,
right.
and she was invited to perform at a prison in California. And she recounts this experience. I was talking to her about it, and sometime in the last couple of years, and that she was invited by a nonprofit organization that sort of supports these families around uh, visiting prisoners and making sure that they have more than just prison to think about. And so she ended up going with I think some other performers and also some family members who were visiting people who were incarcerated there. And she talks about like the levels of security that and the guards and all this. And the thing that stood out to me in that experience was, even though the prison model is very different than what you experienced in Singapore, that the people there were very grateful that because she did this. I think she was told she was going to get paid some nominal fee, which she never actually got. And they're grateful that she was there, and the family members were also grateful that she was there. Just there as to brighten up their day, right? So just have me remember that experience. And
That's a sweet story. I'm
yeah,
I'm gonna have to remember to ask your mom next time I see her.
definitely. Yeah, I think
But
she'd love to. Yeah.
yeah, there's something very sweet about this experience. It's a out of the normal realm of our day to day. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
what I appreciate so much about it, and that's what I'm appreciating about this conversation, is there's so many parallels to the ways in which we're wanting organizations to do better. Never forgetting that people are working with humans, and never forget to play the long game. I think this applies anywhere.
Mm.
Applies anywhere.
Everywhere. Absolutely.
Everywhere. Yeah. So yeah, quite the experience. So next time you go, okay, then we can both say,
Yeah, I'm sad I missed it. I really wanted to go, so I'm glad that you got to go. But next time, I definitely want to go, and as a visitor, because I don't want to sleep on a mat in no air conditioning. I don't think I could do it.
you're too fragile, man. Yeah,
I am. I'm so
you wouldn't make it.
delicate.
You wouldn't make it. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it's been really fun exploring this topic with you, Chuck.
A real pleasure. All right, everybody, stay safe
Stay kind.
and stay human.